It's time to move away from the RB2K and embrace wrathful change. Today, we're going to be talking about building a Vessels of Wrath World Leaders list. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Red Path. My name is Dara and you're watching Competitive Insights. Today we're going to be continuing our content on the Vessels of Wrath and talking all about army list construction. It's been a few weeks since Games Workshop released the World Leaders Grotma's Detachment, the Vessels of Wrath, and since then hundreds of World Leader players have gone back to the proverbial drawing board as we scheme and plan how to construct new and innovative lists which take advantage of this powerful set of army rules. Today's video is going to dive deep into constructing a vessel's list, all the different archetypes that you can build towards, what key units make the army work, and the main decisions you're going to have to make when deciding between a land raider and multiple hellbrutes. It's going to be a very fun and hopefully very helpful video, so grab yourselves a brew and let's dive into it. So over the last year, there's been a certain amount of stagnation in list innovation for world leaders as clearly optimized competitive builds have emerged, including the RB2K, which has been utilized to great success by various members of the Red Path. However, all of that has just been thrown into chaos with the emergence of a brand new detachment. Vessels of Wrath is a very powerful one, and it pushes world leader players into a new direction. It favors builds which do not use Angron, though that's not to say he isn't a competitive choice in a Vessel's list, and it provides a set of interesting tools which can disrupt enemy plans at the cost of damage output. Knowing how best to build a list that implements these tools while taking into account the downsides of reduced damage is no easy task. I've seen a lot of people struggling over the last few weeks, trying to desperately cram all the new toys into one box but being unable to make it fit. That's a pretty normal reaction. When a brand new set of rules drops, you'll naturally want to try all of them out, but the reality is that we simply don't have the option to put everything on the table. So difficult choices have to be made when it comes to building those lists, and we're going to break down those choices into a set of distinct decision trees which will make your list building easier. Before we jump into that, we do need to consider exactly what the competitive concept of Vassals of Wrath actually is. What is it good at? What is it trying to do? And what are its major weaknesses? This will help inform our unit selection before we even start thinking about building a list, allowing us to rule out obviously weak choices. By now, I'm sure most of you have had the chance to digest the actual Vessel's rule set, so I'm not going to waste any time going through the nuts and bolts of that, and instead highlight how all those rules come together to present a specific playstyle. In general, the detachment ability and stratagem selection in Vessels tends to favor hammer units. Hammer units are ones which I typically define as a larger model count with a high damage ceiling. These will typically be units that you send in after your initial skirmishing waves and will actually get significant work done on the table. Good examples of these include Exalted 8-Bound and Berserker Bricks. Because you can layer so many buffs on individual units in Vessels, these hammer units then become immensely powerful, and the lack of +1 strength and attack is made up for by these abilities. It also means that smaller MSU style units tend to lose out in Vessels, as the combination of decreased strength and attacks, alongside the strats and abilities not being as efficient on them, means you get a lot less mileage out of units like 5-man Berserkers or 3-man 8-bound. For these reasons, it's logical to assume that most top level competitive Vessels list will include 3 to 4 hammer units. Additionally, where Vessels loses some baseline damage ceilings, it gains a lot of disruptive tools and durability boosts, especially when compared to the Index. The stratagems shine here, with the ability for a wide selection of units to gain the Blood Surge rule and forcing desperate escape tests when enemy units attempt to fall back. These provide additional headaches for your opponent to have to consider, so ensuring that you're including units that can utilize these stratagems is of paramount importance. Furthermore, we can't ignore the potential durability that this detachment offers. With so many rules that favor the inclusion of a Foot Demon Prince, his invulnerable save boosting ability for 8-bound variants, when coupled with the mini transhuman stratagem, means you can create exalted 8-bound bricks that are ridiculously durable and, of course, for 1 CP can blood surge after being shot. For these reasons, I think exalted 8-bound will see a place in essentially every competitive Vessels list. Finally, there's a bunch of units in our index which gain zero benefit from being run in vessels. While people may have a particular love for these units and want to run them, in order to maximize efficiency and push for the most competitive builds, we do also realistically have to address their usefulness in this detachment. Notable inclusions are most of the demon engines here and vehicles, and certain infantry units such as Terminators. These generally tend to be more efficient in the index, but we'll have a look at niche cases for some of them in a bit. So, to recap quickly, Vessels of Wrath tends to favour builds which include meaty hammer units with a preference towards Exalted 8-bound, and rewards players for creating durable Death Ball units that have a variety of disruptive abilities. But we can't ignore scoring elements, as you don't want your hammer units running off doing actions, and this is where the list building gets tricky. You really want 4 hammer units, but you tend to sacrifice scoring or skirmishing if you build that way. So finding a balance between these elements is key to constructing the most efficient vessels list. And while we may not have discovered the exact build just yet, maybe this video will get your creative juices going, and you can be the author of the next RB2K. And before moving on to the actual list build itself, I'm going to quickly remind you all that myself and Brian put out a tier list of all our units and how they rank in Vessels of Wrath. That's a great starting point before getting into this video, as it will elaborate on certain aspects of list building which I don't want to repeat today. I'll quickly highlight the tier list here, and I'm going to draw your attention to the top 2 tiers of the list. These tiers here are where 90% of the units in a vessel list will be coming from. They take the greatest advantage of the rule set, ensuring that we are optimizing our unit efficiency and have the best tools at our disposal. But I think that's about enough of a preamble. You're here for list discussion, so let's dive into it. As I mentioned, I'm going to go through this as if it were a decision tree, and each branch of the tree will inevitably divide into specific list archetypes that work in vessels. While the end result of some of these builds will be more competitive than others, I don't want that to discourage you from trying out more exotic lists. Vessels is a detachment which rewards innovation and flexibility, so don't take my word as Khorne's gospel. There's a lot of experimentation still to be done, and we're a long way from finding the most optimal list. So without further ado, let's jump into the list build. When it comes to building a Vessels of Wrath list, the first and most important question we have to answer is if we are including Angron or not. Over the last year, Nongron builds have amassed a bit of a cult following, and I enjoyed quite a bit of success experimenting with the archetype at several major tournaments. Longtime viewers of the channel will know that I have a particular bias towards the Nongron archetype, but for the purposes of today's video, I won't be letting that favoritism influence the content. So, that being said, we do have to fundamentally question the viability of Angron versus Nongron in the context of Vessels of Wrath. The detachment presents a lot of ways to play without Angron, and if you choose to go for the Nongron style, you'll generally find that you have more tools available. Angron doesn't benefit from the vast majority of rules in this detachment, with the only key stratagem for him being the -1 to be wounded in shooting. Now, that's still an excellent stratagem to use on Angron, and he does provide a lot of good buffs for a Vessels list, namely his reroll hits aura, which you can't really get from anywhere else. Furthermore, he's also a source of high damage output, something which Vessels does struggle with, meaning he's a great answer for high toughness vehicle-based opponents. Taking all that into account, it's actually relatively tough to make this decision. Without doubt, the index detachment favors using Angron, but when it comes to Vessels, you can actually build an equally competitive list without him, but the final structure of that list will be very different. That's why it's always going to be the first step in building a Vessels list, and everything that comes afterwards will be informed by this decision. With that in mind, we'll proceed through the decision tree, first focusing on if you have chosen to actually bring Angron in your list. So having selected Angron, the next question to ask ourselves is if we're going to bring a Demon Prince or not. Again, because of the toolbox available in Vessels, this is actually a real consideration compared to the index, and the Prince can offer a significant durability boost to your infantry units, so even though we are bringing Angron, we can still get value out of the Vessels tools if we increase the durability of those units that can use them. Of course, the Wing Prince is also an option, but losing the +1 strength and attack really hurts his damage output, so if we're bringing Angron, we can probably find a better use for those points. The main issue with choosing a Prince in an Angron build is that the Foot Prince is also not cheap. Coming in at over 200 points with any of the enhancements That's over 25% of your list in just 2 models. Considering the expense of our units, this means that we're going to be hard pressed to find space to fulfill our scoring and damage output requirements in the rest of the list. The trickiest part here is definitely balancing the amount of hammer or damage output units with your scoring elements, and can result in a list which is prone to collapse if slightly misplayed. Once you've made your unit selection though, you'll probably have to spend a bit of time optimizing your points and adjusting things on a micro level just to make sure that everything is correct. Conversely, choosing not to take the prince in an Angron build means we don't have this concern, and we can focus on filling out the list around Angron and not having to worry about revolving around specific units in order to maximize our potential. Builds stemming from this are going to look very familiar. You'll usually be selecting 2 or 3 hammer units to push damage output alongside Angron, and the familiar scoring and skirmishing pieces will make an appearance too. The list shape will look very similar to RB2K style lists, with a decent toolbox of varying units. However, in the context of vessels, certain units will likely be swapped out. In particular, 3-man 8-bound and 5-man berserker units lose a lot of value, since their damage output is significantly reduced and their ability to clear screens is diminished. On the other hand, units like the Juggernaut Lord with the Arc Slaughterer enhancement provide an interesting new option to fill those roles as early skirmishing pieces. So if you're going down this road, the easiest thing is to revisit a competitive build from the index and consider each unit in the context of vessels. Ask yourself, is it getting good benefits from the detachment or significantly disadvantaged? Now, I don't think these are the only viable Angron-based archetypes. I think they will be the main 2 that people will build towards, and the more competitive option will probably involve leaving the prince at home. That said, once you finish building a more conventional Angron-based list, you really do have to ask yourself the question, is it not just more competitive to run it in the index? In my opinion, Angron builds will more or less always be favoured in Butcher Horde. You have a higher chance of resurrecting the Primarch, and the tools available can benefit units which support Angron better. To reiterate though, that doesn't mean you shouldn't consider Angron in vessels. By exploring the detachment with the Primarch, you may stumble upon an awesome build which doesn't seem outwardly obvious. So let's turn our attention to the Nongron side of the decision tree. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot more variation here, and it would be impossible to cover every possible decision to make, so I've tried to summarize them in the broadest sense possible. Similar to the Angron side, the first thing we need to decide is if we're going to include a Demon Prince or not, and if we are, which variant are we going to choose. Because of the array of tools available in vessels, Demon Princes in Nongron builds are extremely viable. They become a powerful fulcrum around which your army can revolve and push those durability-based 8-pound Death Stars to new heights. The Gateway to Glory enhancement also becomes a near auto take for the footprints, immediately removing the hardest part of using the unit and opening up the possibility for some really cool tricks. It also allows you to be more aggressive with your Exalted Bricks, since the improved movement of the Prince means he is more likely to keep pace with those Death Bolts. We've already seen a lot of people eyeing up the Demon Prince on foot, and I think it's going to emerge as one of the most popular builds in vessels. The Wing Prince is another matter entirely. Unlike the Foot Prince, the list won't really revolve around him, and instead he will be like a harassment side piece. He's another decent target for Gateway, though the uses for it on him are significantly lessened. It does allow you to ingress him into a building and come crashing out in the next turn, or charge over annoying screens, but in general, I would only be putting it on him if I had the points to spare. Similarly, there was some initial excitement about using Arc Slaughterer on him, but it usually means he'll be begging to be a Vessel's target so that his damage will improve, and otherwise he's essentially just recreating a lesser version of the Glaive on a unit which doesn't already output enough damage for his points. That said, choosing a Wing Prince build does mean your army is somewhat less anchored around one individual monster, allowing you to be a bit more flexible with your movement and more forgiving if you misplay the model. Of course, you can also opt to leave both princes at home. By doing this, you open up a lot of options, at the cost of those hyper durable exalted Death Stars. On that, dropping the footprints doesn't massively reduce the survivability of those units. The 4+ invulnerable save equates to about a 16% boost in survivability, And I don't know if that's significant enough for the prince to be a must-have. As someone who's used the prince a lot over the last year, I've noticed it as being a very good buff, but it does sometimes force you into difficult positions. So a Nongron build without any prince at all is definitely viable, and also opens up the possibility of using that gateway enhancement on a Juggernaut Lord. This is a really big advantage for that model in particular, as it allows them to viably attach to either Berserkers or Exalted 8 bounce, giving them a decent buff for movement, charging, and surging. Don't forget, in Vessels, you can also 1 CP Blood Surge on those 8-bound variants, and with that Jugglord attached, you'll be rerolling any bad rolls. So you'll probably find that in a Vessels list, optimizing your points is very tricky. And by removing that footprints, you free up a lot of your economy, potentially allowing for other viable inclusions. And it's definitely one of the tougher decisions to make when it comes to non-Gron Vessel builds, so have a think about it and see what suits your playstyle best. But once you've made that decision on including a prince or not, and what kind of prince to include, we move on to what is really the meat of the list. And I'm going to talk a lot about hammer units here, since Vessel-based lists will almost always revolve around how many and what hammer units you include. Depending on your prince decision, the hammer units will sometimes pick themselves, but let's walk through the process. So we'll consider the footprints first. The main decision here is actually choosing how many hammer units to include. Between myself and the other members of the team, we've hummed and hawed a lot about if this should be 3 or 4 hammer units. And if you're running that footprints, you're pretty much always going to be including a minimum of 2 max Exalted 8-bound units as part of this. They just benefit so much from being near him, and in Vessels they have a lot of tools available. The question then is what other hammers to take and how many. Naturally, we gravitate towards Berserkers. They gain a decent amount of buffs in Vessels, notably the ability to improve their strength, AP, and reroll wounds against targets. A 10-man unit of these, led by either Khorne or the Master of Executions, won't go astray. The hard part is deciding if you want to take another 10-man, led by whichever of those characters you didn't initially pick. There's pros and cons to the choice, but firstly we have to consider the leaders. Khorne allows Berserkers to really maximize their damage ceiling and is a great source of damage himself, not losing too much by not being in Butcher Horde. Mo, on the other hand, provides Fight First for the unit, a very powerful anti-combat tool, and particularly with the ability to switch on improved AP and strength for a CP, that Fight First can be really clutch. However, losing 1 strength and attack really hurts him, and Arc Slaughter is not quite as potent as the Glaive when put on Mo. If, like me, you hate choosing between Angron's 2 favorite children, you can opt to include them both, building 4 hammer units into your list. But this will reduce the amount of skirmisher and scoring units you can include, meaning you might have to push one of those hammers out earlier than you'd like, or use it to accrue victory points. And it'll make building the rest of the list quite difficult. If you opt instead to include only 3 hammer units, you have a better spread of choice. Filling out your skirmisher and scoring pieces becomes a lot easier, and you could even turn to gunline support as an option too. And there's actually a decent argument for including some shooting support in a Vessel's list, be it Forge Fiends, Predators, or Brigands. They can apply some pressure to units we can't otherwise reach, potentially clearing screens, and can also take heat off our combat elements as they get into position. However, it is worth remembering that in general, shooting platforms in World Leaders are pretty inefficient and unreliable, so I wouldn't lean too hard into this and ensure that you aren't sacrificing more important scoring and skirmishing pieces for their inclusion. Padding the last elements of the list will depend on if you've gone for full gunline support or not here, and for me this is actually usually the most annoying part of list design. In my opinion, it's also low-key where the best lists are fine-tuned and optimized. Ensuring the balance between scoring, damage output and support is perfected. It's absolutely crucial, and depending on the decisions you've already made, you need to reassess your entire list and consider what elements are lacking or overpopulated. Turning our attention to the wing prints as an option, there's going to be some similarities here. The first choice here is to build into hammer units, and if you choose to do so, it'll follow pretty much the exact same logic we just discussed with the footprints. Naturally, we're trading durability for movement flexibility here, and because you're taking the wing prints, you aren't necessarily anchored to having to choose 2 exalted bricks. There's maybe a world where you consider a Terminator break in this build, though as we discussed in the tier list video, they're not optimal in vessels. Regardless, the Winged Prince does present a wider choice of hammer options, and you're still likely to end up trying to decide between 3 or 4 in a list. The other alternative build is to go MSU style. For those who don't know, MSU refers to multiple small units and is an archetype which used to be very popular in 8th and 9th edition, though 10th has seen a significant drop in its use. As you're not relying on the Footprints Death Star, you can actually push a much wider style of list in this way. However, it's worth noting that MSU style lists do have a big drawback in vessels, their damage ceiling. This presents us with a few options to overcome that issue. We can select only units which are considered to be reliable MSU options, such as those smaller Exalted squads, but our unit pool choice here is quite limited. In vessels, as we mentioned, smaller 8-bound and Berserker units drop off a lot in terms of damage potential. So this probably isn't the most optimal direction. Instead, we could add in 1 or 2 hammer units to shore up those weaknesses. They give us some options for cracking tough nuts, while still retaining plenty of use. Finally, we could build in some gun line support, and in the MSU style, you can probably afford to go with more gun options, and this archetype does generally enjoy its support. Forge Fiends are particularly solid, as the possibility of triggering Battle Shock means that your charging elements may not have to worry about certain defensive buffs. Regardless of which of these 3 options you go with, the fine-tuning is broadly similar to before, mainly optimizing those last few points. Finally, the last main decision block for Nongron builds is the Prince-less option. Broadly speaking, 2 of the main options here are again hammer builds and MSU style, which we've just discussed. But completely ditching the princes does free up those enhancements that you've got to be spread across other characters, and in my opinion lends itself to a third build option because of this, the Berserker Rush. This build is broadly centered around spamming high volumes of Berserkers with attached characters that enhance either their movement or damage output. In this build, your HQ selection is going to be one of the main turning points, and you're probably always going to have both an Arc Slaughter Juggerlord and a Gateway Juggerlord leading 10 Berserkers each. Then it's really about if you include Khorne or Mo with 10, or both. And if you decide to go the whole hog with 40 Berserkers, you're gonna need at least 2 Rhinos, and at that point you've got a significant chunk of your points taken up, roughly 1300 or thereabouts. I actually did run a Berserker spam style Nongron list last year, and there's definitely a critical mass of Blood Surge checks which can break an opponent, but you still probably want to be including a hammer unit of Exalted to make sure that you have an answer for the toughest opposition. Alternatively, you could opt to go with some gunline support as well. In this case, I think you'd be looking at allying in some Brigands and bringing heavier guns to deal with meaty targets. Either way though, you're gonna have to very carefully refine your scoring unit inclusions as well. And this list is a difficult one to balance. You want enough Zerks to push critical mass, but not so much that it takes away from your scoring and capacity to deal with hard targets. However, the possibility of any infantry surging in vessels with 1 CP, it means you can really front load that surge threat even more. And with that said, we can actually finish off the decision tree. As you can see, it's gotten pretty big, and this is definitely not covering all the possible archetypes and builds. I have tried to hit on what I think are the most viable and popular archetypes so far, but there's definitely room for personalization and unique takes which totally move away from these. Next up, I've summarized the tree into 4 key archetypes, which I think will broadly constitute the majority of Vessel's lists. So let's have a look at that now. So, after a rather intense series of list building decisions, what archetypes do we have? Well, as you can see here, I think they broadly break down into 4 main groups: Angron centric, Footprints hammers, MSU wide, and mixed element archetypes. Each of these has positives and negatives, so let's walk through them. Angron centric builds probably the most beginner friendly archetype here. If you've gotten competitive experience with the index, they'll feel quite similar and familiar, quite easy to learn. Angron himself is still a fantastic piece with a very high damage ceiling and is a buffer for nearby units. And of course, a resurrection can always swing a game state. However, these Angron builds don't take full advantage of the vessel's tools available, so the skill ceiling is substantially lower. And realistically, if you are building around Angron, you're probably just better off playing Butcher Horde. The Footprints build arguably utilizes vessels the best out of all the archetypes. It leans fully into the available tools and is a real headache for opponents to deal with. It also creates the most durable build in the form of those Exalted and Prince Death Stars, which can take an incredible amount of punishment. Finally, compared to Angron builds, they're generally going to have 1 to 2 extra units in the list due to the removal of the Primarch. However, Footprints builds are not easy to master. They have a very high skill ceiling and require the player to not only think ahead, but also to be fully aware of the current board state. Mistakes and misplays are severely punishing, particularly mispositioning the prince and his surrounding units, making this a difficult archetype for beginner players to see success with. Having spent the bones of a year running Footprints-based Nongron builds, there's a lot of nuance involved, but ultimately if you do take the time to master it, it will improve your own skill. The MSU-wide style archetype is one of the more interesting ones. It can be quite forgiving due to the high number of units, and by its own nature there's quite a lot of choice when it comes to actually building those lists. However, as we have discussed, the damage ceiling is a lot lower and you'll often find yourself struggling to kill tougher targets. This can result in you having to commit multiple units to a single fight and overexposing many elements of your army, which can result in the actual MSU build falling apart completely. And finally, Combined Arms, it's a pretty cool approach. It provides a nice amount of flexibility and allows you to use gun elements to support your combat pieces, apply pressure to the opponent, and threaten otherwise inaccessible units. Your choice of gunline elements should be informed by what units you've already built into the list, as not all gun platforms support every combat unit equally. The issue with this archetype really stems from the gun platforms themselves not taking full advantage of vessels and being generally unreliable. So to make this archetype work, you have to ensure that you're not overcommitting in the gun department while still taking units that are valuable. So while these archetypes cover the majority of vessel builds, there's definitely more niche case ones which I haven't touched on, but do let me know down below if you think there's something I've missed. And before we wrap this video up, I'm going to give you folks a little teaser of what I've been brewing up in the list department, an example of a Vessels of Wrath list built for competitive play. So this particular list is going to be a Nongron build, with the Demon Prince on foot as the fulcrum. Obviously he's going to have Gateway to Glory as his enhancement to allow him to get to where he needs to be. And if we follow that decision tree that we went through earlier, I'm going to build for a 3 hammer style list. And my hammers will be 2 bricks of Exalted 8-bound and a unit of 10 Berserkers with Khorne. Now, we need to turn our attention to the rest of the list and see how we pad out the remaining points. I'm actually going to opt for some gunline support and throw in 2 Predator Annihilators here. I'm testing these out at the minute, and while I'm not sure if they're necessarily the best pick, I do like the fire support that they offer. With them added, we need to balance our scoring, skirmishing, and support. For scoring, 2 squads of Jackals should be enough. The Pred will be driving around in the backfield, so we can afford to go a little thin on those elements. For skirmishing, I'm going to add 3 units of Exalted 8-bound and the Arc Slaughterer Juggerlord. In this list, I really like the combo of these 2. Against wider builds, they'll run separately, but facing tough opposition, I can merge the Juggerlord into the 8-bound unit to create a micro hammer. Finally, for the support elements, we're going to go back to the old reliables, Invocatus and a Rhino. Invo provides the scout threat which opponents have to respect and is himself a skirmisher. The Rhino doesn't need to be explained, but functions as both support and scoring as well. So looking at this list, it's quite well rounded. It's got 3 units which have a high damage output, plenty of scoring options, some gunline support, and enough skirmishers to get by. I'm going to be running this at an RTT this weekend, so do follow along in our Discord and see how it goes. Ryan is also at a tournament this weekend with a much wilder Vessels build, and we'll probably have some content around that in the upcoming weeks. Ryan's also going to be doing a video on key tricks and tactics in Vessels, so if you have been enjoying our coverage of the new Detachment so far, make sure you tune in for that. You can also get the rawer version of our takes on list building by signing up to our Patreon and joining the Patreon competitive channel in our Discord. Things are a lot more deranged there, but we will help you out as much as we can. Of course, the main Discord is also free to join, and there's plenty of great players there working out how best to optimize Vessels of Wrath. And for now, I think it's about time to wrap this video up. If you have enjoyed it, if you found it useful, make sure to drop a like and subscribe because every little helps when it comes to growing the Red Path. I'd love to hear your own thoughts on building Vessels lists, so comment down below and share them with me. But let's close this out. You've been watching The Red Path, I've been Dara, and this has been Competitive Insights. So until the next one, you stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.